April 6, 1945. The waters off Okinawa are deceptively calm. Dawn breaks in streaks of pale silver across the Pacific, glinting off the armored decks of America's vast invasion fleet. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, hundreds of them, stretch across the horizon like a floating city. Below deck, radar operators sit hunched in dim green light. Their screens pulse with faint echoes, dots growing, multiplying, converging. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan's final weapon is coming. Suddenly, the air shudders with distant engines. Kamikazes, hundreds of them, screaming out of the rising sun, each pilot sworn to die for the Emperor. But this time, the Americans see them coming. Invisible waves of radar sweep the skies, locking onto targets miles away. Anti-aircraft guns whine to life, their fire guided not by eyes, but by electronics. The age of radar has arrived. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had reached its most brutal and desperate phase. Japan's empire, once stretching across vast ocean territories, was collapsing under relentless American advance. Island after island had fallen. Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima. Each defeat brought the U.S. Navy's carriers, bombers, and battleships closer to Japan's home islands. But with the fall of airfields and the loss of experienced pilots, Japan's once formidable air arm was reduced to fragments. Fuel was scarce. Training was rushed. Many new aviators barely knew how to fly. Facing the overwhelming industrial and technological power of the United States, Japan's leaders turned to an ancient ideal: sacrifice. They called them Tokotai, special attack units. The world would remember them as kamikazes, divine wind. Young men, often barely 20 years old, were gathered at bases across Kyushu and Formosa. They were told that one man, one plane, and one bomb could change the tide of war. Propaganda films promised eternal honor. Letters home spoke of duty and destiny. But behind the ceremonies and flags lay silent fear, an unspoken knowledge that death was certain. The first kamikaze attacks in late 1944 shocked the Americans. Pilots deliberately diving into ships with bombs strapped to their planes seemed beyond reason, a horrifying new form of warfare. Yet by early 1945, the U.S. Navy was no longer unprepared. Engineers and scientists had been working for years on systems to detect, track, and destroy incoming aircraft long before they came into view. Radar, once a mysterious laboratory experiment, had become the fleet's invisible shield. And as the war closed in on Japan's shores, one final confrontation would determine which force would prevail: faith and sacrifice, or precision and science. Radar, radio detection and ranging, was the unseen revolution of the Second World War. Developed in secrecy during the 1930s, it had evolved from a crude curiosity into a decisive weapon. By 1944, every major U.S. warship carried radar sets capable of detecting aircraft far beyond the horizon, giving crews precious minutes, sometimes tens of minutes, to prepare their defenses. On the bridges of destroyers and battleships, new instruments glowed in eerie green. The Mark 37 gunfire control system, connected to powerful radar directors like the Mk-12 and Mk-22. These systems didn't just see the enemy. They calculated range, altitude, and trajectory, adjusting gun aim automatically as targets moved through the sky. At the same time, another breakthrough had quietly entered the arsenal: the VT proximity fuse. Inside each anti-aircraft shell, a tiny radio sensor waited for an approaching aircraft. Instead of exploding on impact or by a timer, these shells detonated when they came within a few meters of a plane, shredding wings and engines with invisible precision. Together, these innovations transformed the battlefield. The once chaotic flak curtain became a controlled, mathematical defense. Radar operators tracked formations miles away, plotting speed and direction. Fire control computers translated those numbers into angles and timings. Gunners no longer fired blindly into the sky. They fired with purpose, guided by invisible waves and unseen circuits. By The time Japan's kamikaze waves began to strike in large numbers, especially during the Battle of Okinawa. The U.S. fleet was armed with a defense network unlike anything the world had ever seen. Ships could coordinate their radar screens, relay information instantly, and bring down attackers before they even appeared over the horizon. To the kamikaze pilots diving toward those glowing gun lines, it was no longer a battle of courage. It was a race against a machine that never blinked. Angle 1. The human side. Fear behind the divine. Wind in Japanese air bases during the final months of the war. The myth of the divine wind began to fracture under the weight of reality. Kamikaze pilots were told that the Americans would never see them coming, that speed, faith, and surprise would carry them to victory. But when they neared the fleet, that illusion vanished. Through the cockpit glass, they saw tracer fire arcing upward long before they reached attack range. Entire formations were torn apart at distances once thought impossible. Pilots reported their comrades bursting into flame miles away from the target, disintegrated by unseen explosions. Few understood why. To them, it seemed as though the Americans possessed a sixth sense, an ability to detect death before it arrived. That invisible power was radar, and it shattered morale. Some pilots, moments before takeoff, hesitated or wept quietly inside their cockpits. Others sang hymns of courage to drown the fear. But once airborne, many realized that no amount of devotion could outfly a machine that could see through clouds, darkness, and distance alike. Angle 2. The tactical side. The birth of the Shield Fleet for the U.S. Navy. The kamikaze threat demanded coordination on a level never before seen. Radar picket ships were stationed dozens of miles ahead of the main fleet, their sole purpose to detect incoming aircraft early and relay warnings by radio. These small destroyers often took the brunt of the first wave, serving as the eyes and ears of the armada. Once the radar pickets sounded the alarm, the defense machine awoke. Combat Information Centers, CICs, across the fleet lit up with activity, screens plotting hundreds of moving blips. Each blip represented a pilot determined to die. Each had to be stopped. Radar-guided gunnery meant that American ships could now form overlapping fields of fire, creating deadly corridors in the sky. The once vulnerable convoys were now shielded by mathematics and electricity. For every kamikaze that broke through, dozens were destroyed before they ever saw their targets. The sea itself had become a wall of radar-guided steel. Angle 3. The technological side. Precision through circuits inside. The U.S. Navy's fire control centers, radar and electronics fused human instinct with machine precision. The Mark 37 Director, perched high above the deck, scanned the sky, its radar dishes tracking aircraft invisible to the naked eye. Data flowed into the Mark 1A fire control computer, a complex mechanical brain of gears and gyros. It calculated target speed, altitude, wind, and bearing, adjusting every gun's elevation and lead angle in real time. The result was terrifying accuracy. Once the radar locked on, the gunners merely followed instruments, not the sky. With the VT proximity fuse, even near misses became lethal. A shell didn't need to hit a plane. Coming close was enough. The fuse's radio waves detected the aircraft's metal and triggered instant detonation, filling the air with shrapnel. This combination, radar tracking, mechanical computation, and electronic detonation, made each American ship a fortress of invisible intelligence. Kamikazes, approaching at 300 knots, entered zones of layered fire guided by circuits, not sight. Even at night or through heavy weather, the defense never slept. The machine's eyes never closed. Angle 4. The moral side. Flesh against the future. There was a haunting irony in the skies over Okinawa. On one side, young men, flesh, fear, and faith, flew toward certain death, believing sacrifice could save their homeland. On the other, crews guided by radar and mathematics fought not for glory, but for survival. To the Americans, radar was a miracle of science, a tool to save lives. To the Japanese, it was an invisible monster that stripped their sacrifice of meaning. Their courage was swallowed by an unseen power that turned devotion into futility. In those final months, war revealed its new face. The kamikaze represented humanity's oldest weapon, the willingness to die for a cause. The radar-guided guns represented the future, a war fought by machines that could think, see, and kill faster than any human. It was no longer a duel of warriors. It was the first true glimpse of modern warfare, where emotion met circuitry and emotion lost. April 6, 1945, Operation Kikusui-1, the largest kamikaze assault of the war. From airfields across Kyushu, 355 suicide aircraft and hundreds of escort fighters roared into the sky. Their destination, the vast American fleet surrounding Okinawa. For the Japanese command, it was a final act of vengeance, to bleed the invaders before they reached the home islands. Hours later, radar screens aboard the U.S. ships flickered to life. Tiny echoes appeared at the very edge of the scopes, then multiplied rapidly. At first only faint dots, within minutes dozens, then hundreds. On board the destroyer USS Lafay, sailors rushed to battle stations. The ship's Combat Information Center, CIC, came alive with tension. Operators called out bearings and ranges in quick succession. Multiple bogeys, high altitude, closing fast. The Mark 37 director whirred into position. Guns elevated. The ship's entire fire control system locked on invisible targets beyond the horizon. Moments later, the first wave broke through the clouds. Japanese planes, engines screaming, dived in blazing trails toward the fleet. The sky erupted. Radar-guided 5-inch guns fired in perfectly timed bursts, shells exploding mid-air with the deadly precision of proximity fuses. One kamikaze disintegrated before reaching the fleet. Another burst into fire hundreds of meters short, but there were too many. The USS Lafay was hit once, then again. A flaming Zero crashed into her aft deck, setting the ship ablaze. Yet still, her radar-guided batteries kept firing. Across the fleet, the same battle unfolded. Chaos above, cold coordination below. Radar crews calmly tracked, predicted, and destroyed attackers even as their own ships burned. The sea boiled with wreckage and smoke, but the line held. In that moment, the war's nature shifted. Courage and sacrifice were no longer enough to pierce the curtain of science. The battle raged for hours. Wave after wave of kamikazes hurled themselves against the steel wall of the U.S. Navy. By midday, the radar screens were a storm of blips, each one a pilot determined to die. But for every one that reached the fleet, 10 were destroyed by unseen hands. Aboard the USS Missouri, the mightiest of America's battleships, radar operators worked in rhythmic silence. Each incoming trace triggered the firing sequence. Data passed to the Mark 37 computer, guns slewed into position, and the sky above the fleet filled with detonations. The sound was continuous, a deep mechanical thunder echoing across the Pacific. Nearby, the carrier USS Bunker Hill was less fortunate. 2 kamikazes slipped through the storm of radar-directed flak and struck her deck in quick succession. The explosions tore open her hangar, igniting hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel. Yet even as fires raged, nearby ships closed in, forming a protective screen, their radar-guided guns cutting down more attackers before they could strike again. On the USS Lafay, the crew fought for survival. She was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs, yet she refused to sink. Her radar directors were destroyed, her decks burned, but her gunners continued firing manually until the last plane fell. By the day's end, Japan had lost more than 300 aircraft, a staggering price for only a handful of damaged ships. The Americans had bent, but not broken. The kamikazes had proven that faith could wound, but not win. Against radar-guided precision, their courage dissolved into smoke and sea foam. The terrifying mystery that had haunted them, how the Americans always knew, was answered not by divine favor, but by human ingenuity. At Okinawa, radar didn't just protect ships. It decided the future of warfare. When the smoke finally lifted over Okinawa, the Pacific was littered with the remains of Japan's final gamble. Between April and June 1945, over 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched against the U.S. fleet. Nearly every type of aircraft Japan had left, from Zeros to obsolete trainers, was thrown into the storm. But radar had stripped away their only advantage: surprise. For every American ship struck, dozens more survived because of early detection and coordinated fire. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Out of thousands of kamikazes, only a small fraction ever reached their targets. More than 7,000 Japanese pilots died. The U.S. Navy, though battered, endured. 36 ships sunk, 368 damaged, but the fleet kept fighting, kept advancing, and never withdrew. Radar had given American commanders something Japan could no longer claim: control. From radar picket ships ringing the island to the vast network of combat information centers coordinating real-time defenses, the fleet had become an interconnected organism. It could see beyond the horizon, anticipate the invisible, and strike back with cold precision. For Japan's high command, the results were devastating. The kamikaze, once hailed as the divine wind that would save the empire, had become a symbol of futility. Even the most fanatical pilots could not overcome an enemy that could detect and destroy them before they ever glimpsed their targets. The Pacific sky had changed forever. The age of blind courage had ended, and the age of electronic warfare had begun. The Battle of Okinawa became the ultimate testament to radar's dominance and the tragic futility of Japan's final stand. American ships, once vulnerable to surprise attacks, had evolved into floating networks of sensors and communication. Each radar dish, each proximity fuse, each plotting table was a node in a vast, coordinated defense system that stretched from ship to ship, wave to wave. For the Japanese military, the results were catastrophic beyond repair. Entire air regiments were annihilated. Aircraft production could no longer keep pace with the losses. Fuel was gone, pilots were gone, and the promise of the divine wind faded into silence. The kamikaze strategy, meant to terrify, had achieved the opposite. It revealed Japan's desperation to the world. In Washington and aboard the U.S. flagship USS Missouri, officers studied the results closely. The radar-controlled gunnery and proximity fuse were no longer secret marvels. They were the proven future of warfare. Their success at Okinawa accelerated radar development across every branch of the military. Within months, similar systems would guide night bombers, submarines, and missile defenses. The Japanese Navy never recovered. After Okinawa, there were no major fleet actions left to fight. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that August, Japan's skies were already defenseless, emptied of hope, stripped bare by the invisible reach of radar. By the time of surrender on September 1945, the war had entered a new age, one where battles were decided not just by bravery or firepower, but by the unseen language of radio waves, logic circuits, and data. The radar that once saved ships would soon reshape the entire world. In the vast silence that followed Japan's surrender, the Pacific once again became calm. The seas that had echoed with engines and explosions now reflected only the gray light of dawn. For the men who fought at Okinawa, on both sides, the memory endured. The kamikaze pilots had embodied devotion beyond reason. Yet their courage collided with something they could neither see nor fight. A force born not of faith, but of calculation. Radar had no face, no emotion, no mercy. It simply saw, measured, and destroyed. It was here, in those final months of the war, that the world glimpsed the future, where technology began to outthink the human spirit. The kamikaze's sacrifice became a monument to the limits of bravery in an age of machines. And for the sailors who watched radar screens glow in the dark, the lesson was hauntingly clear. Victory in modern war would no longer belong to those who fought hardest, but to those who could see first. The divine wind had met its end, not in battle, but in the silent hum of radar, sweeping endlessly across the sea.